Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are already running a little bit late, so let's try and catch up and make up time for this technical session. I think the framework and the background for what this day is about has already been laid pretty much in the plenary session, the introductory session this morning. This particular session, the goal is to flesh out an investor, financiers, or partners' perspective on the importance of accounting reform and how it could affect, in particular, the opportunities for the Indian Railways to finance its future growth and development. On that, maybe I'll just spend 4 or 5 minutes giving you some introductory remarks, and then I will invite our distinguished panelists to make their respective presentations, starting with Ms. Purandare from SBI CAPS, who will share with us the lender's perspective, as Namita was explaining. Shri Salhotra, who's from Alstom and therefore has quite a lot of experience with partnering with the Indian Railways, and so his perspective on the importance of accounting information. And then finally, Mr. Chadda, to give us, I hope, not just a professional, objective perspective on what it needs to become a sustainable, commercially self-sustaining organization, but also, to the extent you can, Pankaj, some experience from what equivalent organizations are doing internationally. Which brings me to really the 2-3 points that I wanted to make with respect to accounting for the Indian Railways. So, you know, conceptually the challenge of accounting reforms or accounting for an entity like the railways has to do with the nature of the organization itself. So, the Indian Railways is a public service and is a department of the Government of India, and therefore has a certain set of obligations that are very, very different from the obligations and responsibilities of a normal corporate entity. And yet, it is also has a lot of important aspects of a commercial organization and needs also to abide by the discipline of such an organization. And it's not a trivial challenge to actually bring those two elements of the organization like Indian Railways together. A very brief word on what I think is more precisely the nature of the challenge. So, I mean, I'm an economist by training, so I use a certain vocabulary to describe complex problems. But in essence, it's an extreme case of maximizing efficiency and productivity given very, very severe constraints. So it's a constrained maximization problem. Now, what are the constraints that the Indian Railways faces, right? Broadly speaking, you have three sets of stakeholders at least, external stakeholders to whom you are accountable. First and foremost are the taxpayers, and the taxpayers expect that the funds or the taxes that they contribute are being used in an effective manner to deliver something that is in the public interest, that is in the national interest, without any waste. I mean, there was a very interesting statistic that I came across the other day. In India, it turns out that less than 4.5% of our voters are actually taxpayers. And there is, as you can see with the challenges that we are facing with demonetization, that there is a great sense amongst a very large number of citizens in this country that they don't feel obliged to pay taxes, and they don't feel obliged to pay taxes because they feel that government or the state is not giving them the quality of service that they believe they should get. So it's a very difficult stakeholder community to please, but they are ultimately our bosses. So there is the citizen as taxpayer, then there is another community of stakeholders that we are accountable to as the railways, and that is citizens as customers. And it's a different version of the same problem. So I don't feel like paying taxes because, you know, I find that government is not delivering services as it should. It's exactly the same thing for the citizen as a customer. And you find it in sector after sector. You find it in healthcare, you find it in the power sector. We were just talking about the power sector before we walked into this room. As also in railways, customers and citizens will only be willing to pay for services, provided they believe that they are of a certain quality. So there are a number of surveys that have been done, for example, with respect to infrastructure service delivery. And it's quite interesting. What you find is that in survey after survey, people, and especially the poor, this is also very interesting, say and respond that they will be willing to pay provided the service that is provided to them is reliable. So if people were assured of 24/7 electricity, they would be willing to pay a higher price for it. And de facto, actually, citizens end up paying for services that are otherwise not delivered to them. So you take water supply, for example. If no water is available in the national capital region, people have to turn to tankers. And they pay enormous amounts of money to alternative providers to get what is an essential service. So customers as citizens as customers, citizens as taxpayers, and then finally, the third set of stakeholders that we have to worry about are investors and financiers. And the reason why we have to worry about investors and financiers is that it is vitally and strategically important for the Indian Railways to, despite its current financial situation, to actually invest more. And it has to invest more because that is the road, or that is the track to generating incremental revenues in the future. So we are actually, we are riding a bicycle. It's not as if, so we cannot say that, look, the problems of the railways can be solved if only we can address the cross-subsidy issue. Citizens as customers of the Indian Railway should be asked to pay more, otherwise we cannot invest. The problem with that expectation is that you cannot expect citizens as customers to pay more unless citizens feel that the service they are getting from the railways is actually of a certain quality. So in order to get the customer to pay more, we actually have to invest in improving the quality of our service. So unless you invest, you don't get the revenues from the customer. Exactly the same kind of problem is with freight revenues. We have extreme network congestion, but in order to retrieve some of the declining share of freight traffic that we are losing to roads, we actually have to invest in network expansion. So we can't stop bicycling. The only choice we have is to bicycle faster. And to get more mileage out of that bicycle, that is where accounting reforms have to play a vital role. The most important message, I think, that I took away from this morning was that accounting reform is not about accountancy. It's about much more than that. I mean, MR talked about accountability. I think that's one very important aspect of why accounting reforms are important. But equally, accounting reforms are about transformational change. So, when you talk about, the three legs of your program, one is accrual accounting, then there is cost accounting, and the third one is outcome-based accounting. The latter two involve the participation of the entire organization, not just financial advisors in the railways. Because it means that we have to come together to define what our performance metrics are, have information systems that allow us to track performance, therefore hold each other accountable within the organization for performance and outcomes and improvements. And from experience in many other organizations, corporate and non-corporate, using information that becomes available from greater transparency in accounting can be an extremely powerful tool to drive transformational change, because that information is very, very rich source for initiating, triggering, nurturing behavioral change within the organization. So unless you have the information, you cannot change behavior. When you have the information, you can hold the mirror to people and say, look, this is what we agreed to do, but this is what is actually happening. Therefore, I can now hold you accountable for the results that weren't met. Equally, this is the information. Now we can understand why making this investment over that investment actually makes better sense. So it drives behavioral change in budgeting and planning, in prioritizing our investment program, and that's extremely important when you have very limited resources. It drives behavioral change in terms of efficiency and managing cost, improving the quality of our operations. It drives behavioral change to keep ourselves accountable to the stakeholders that I've talked about, because now you have new information, you can go back to Parliament or you can go back in the realm of public relations and say, look, this is what we spent and invested on safety, and this is the outcome that we have delivered on safety. Information in a nutshell that becomes available through this exercise is vitally important for everybody within the railways to take charge of a narrative that will drive transformational change. So this is not just a boring exercise for bean counters and accountants. This is a vital, central element of any transformational change. I mean, just to put it in a broader context, I mean, I'm a banker now, so I'm living through day to day in a different perspective the challenges that have been thrown to us through demonetization. The expectation and the hope through this whole demonetization exercise is that this discontinuity will drive behavioral and transformational change across the whole country, right? Our goal really is, in many ways, it's a much broader context. As a country, my personal view is that we cannot have a country of 1.2 billion people where the state machinery, and the railways is one of the largest components of the state machinery, unless that state machinery functions to a much higher level of productivity and efficiency, That is the first step we need to take to drive transformational change in the country generally. So from the micro to the very macro, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that this journey, I mean, the title of this session is, today's conference is Accounting Reforms in Indian Railways. It should really be accounting reform for transformational change. Starting with the railways, imagine if the accounting experiment is successful in the railways, I can imagine what the demonstration effect this would have for all our electricity distribution countries around the country. If the railways is able to succeed in doing this, it will be a lesson, it will be a beacon for so many other parts of the state machinery that we could actually accelerate the pace of change that we want on a much wider scale. So with that, Varsha, we will start with you. If you will share with us the lender's perspective.